about trying to help the poor, and that believes in love. And I think it's been recognised as Chaplin's masterpiece and one of the greatest films of the American movie industry. So, who today is making films like that? That's what we want to find out at the Delphic Academy and contact them. So thanks for raising that, yeah. Okay, let's move on then, and let's look at our periodic table, which should be over there.
Let's turn that off.
Okay, that's one. Great, thank you. Good. Right. Okay, what have you chosen one? Not yet, okay. Have you got one?
Yeah.
Okay, what are you going to
I'm
do?
very curious in the same place. New religious movement, Japanese and Chinese, 99B.
Okay, good. Right. So, yes, so when I was teaching religious studies at the University of London and Oxford and got really into it, I became really conscious of this field called new religious movements, which is it's a big thing now among religious scholars, because most people think of religion as all very old-fashioned and all what happened a long time ago. But no, it's bubbling away still, and there are new religions coming into being, grafted often onto old ones. They're like evolutions of them. And I discovered there's a really flourishing new religious movement going on in Japan and in China. And let's look at Japan first. So there are groups like, it's called Omoto, and there's Seichi no Rei, and other of these, they're sort of based partly on Shintoism, but then they've incorporated teachings from the West, things of Christianity and things of Buddhism. So they're more like a synthesis. We'd call them, and basically the founders of these new religious movements regard themselves as prophets, effectively, who brought a new insight into the Japanese world. And there's a whole list of them. One of them is the Society of Prayer for World Peace, founded by Goi Masahisa, which gives these peace polls around the world. And they're very interesting. I've done quite a lot of research on it. And mostly they have their own new holy books, which are received by the founder in Japanese. They see that the universe is run by the spirit world, and that therefore we owe piety and our intelligence to the spirit beings, which we call gods, they call kami in Japan. They're usually not in favour of the Japanese flirtation with imperialism and right-wing authoritarian governments in the 30s. These founders were sometimes spent time in prison. Often they're pacifists, they're peace-oriented, and they wanted a different kind of approach to Japan's international relations. Some have a more Buddhist frame, so Soka Gakkai is one of these, which is a huge popular Buddhist movement, teaching a kind of Pure Land Buddhism, that the world is too corrupt, we can't reach enlightenment from this plane. But if we follow the teachings, we can be reborn in the Pure Land, which is an alternative world from where we can then reach enlightenment. Like the base camp on the Himalaya mountains at the foot of Mount Everest, we have to go there first before we can head off for the summit. Richo Kosei-Kai is another one, who are involved in the World Conference on Religion and Peace, which I used to be the Secretary General for in the UK and Ireland, and I've met, them as well. So religion is flourishing in Japan in these new religious movements. In China as well, although of course in Taiwan it's easier. In the Republic of China it's quite difficult, and for instance the Falun Gong movement, which is a synthesis of kind of sort of Tai Chi and Chinese philosophy and Taoism, has been heavily persecuted, sadly, founded by Li Hongzhi, and some quite, stressful things have happened to them, because the Communist Party wants to keep a strict lid on new religious movements in China. I suppose you could argue that the Chinese Communist movement was a kind of new religious movement, in a sense. I've argued that in my critical study of Marxism that there were lots of spiritual undercurrents in Marxist thought, which were kind of like a new religion in the 19th century. And, a lot of the founders of Marxism in China were quite spiritual, actually, including Mao Zedong, who was a poet, and, they thought they were going to do a whole rebirth of society. And unfortunately, they thought they would do it with violence if people didn't want to join in the project. I argue that this is a mistake, that you can't force people to do spiritual renovation and rebirth with violence. It's not the right way to do it. And I think the idea of communism goes back to the Zoroastrian idea of what's called the Frashakerati, which meant the rejuvenation of the world. This is an epoch predicted in the Zoroastrian religion, which is down in box 122. I think we had it maybe last week or the week before. And it predicts this sort of rebirth of the world. And I think that's what communism was going for. But it forgot to include Ahura Mazda, or the spiritual world. And then you get a sort of pseudo version of it, which ends in tears. So, yes, I think, there are people in China looking at religious studies. I know some professors of peace studies there and things. And I don't think you can destroy religious thinking from the soul of man, but you can educate it and work with it to perfect human nature, which is what Confucius said, and Lao Tzu all those years ago. So, anyway, that's my thoughts on this. There's more details on the website if you're interested. Yeah.
You just said that you cannot destroy the religious aspect of people.
Yeah.
I'm wondering about that. When we see the modern society, how the practice of religion had decreased dramatically. In France, I can speak for France.
Well, these things go in cycles, don't they?
I don't know.
Yeah.
Because maybe this is the first time in history that you do not care so much about weddings, about the way you are buried, the way. So there are some indication that some traditional aspect of religion has been erased. It's a question.
Sure. Well, it's a huge question. I don't have time to do it justice, but all I would say is that all the faiths predict a sort of wave view of history. There are moments of enlightenment when civilizations are very enlightened and ethical. Then there are decaying moments when people become barbaric, and there's even a quote in the Gospel of Matthew when Jesus says about, there's going to come a time when children won't obey their parents, they'll kill their parents, the whole world will go to the dogs, That's this Zoroastrian idea, things get very bad. and you know, I mean, the French Revolution with its extreme atheism ended up doing the Reign of Terror, chopping the heads off people and killing priests and, you know, raping nuns and the whole thing. I mean, and then that was replicated in Cambodia. This revolutionary idea that to achieve social perfection, you've got to abolish all religion and kill all religious people. Yeah, I mean, Stalin and the Bolshevik dream was that. But I don't think as a historian that it works. Well, my point is that it leads to brutalisation and a lot of corpses. And eventually the Cambodian people realised that Pol Pot way is not the way to go. And they got rid of him. And, you know, they restored the fundamental idea that ethics has got to be at the root of civilization, whether it's Buddhist or Christian or humanist or Taoist, it doesn't really matter. Choose any of the boxes, but just don't do mass killings. You know.
Have you seen the movie Killing Fields?
I have, yes, it's terrible.
Horrible.
But I read a biography of Pol Pot recently, actually like a 500-page detailed biography to find out why this guy thought like he did. And basically he was inculcated into atheism in Paris, where it was very fashionable among Marxist students to denigrate God and to be against religion. You know, I take a different view. I want the elevation of the religions through higher knowledge, higher education, which is the point of the table. You know, if only. Anyway, good point though. Right, what have you chosen? Have you got one?
I'm a skeptical guy, so I was curious about humanism and skepticism. 75.
Okay,
Interesting.
good. That follows on nicely from that conversation.
I thought so.
Yeah. Well, it's a fascinating tradition, skepticism. Tell me what you think it is first before I give my background talk on it. What attracts you to that box? Would you identify with it?
Probably not. I'm curious about it because being skeptical, humanist is human, isn't it? Being skeptical to things around you, is this correct?
Yeah.
This guy down in Israel, is that really so? Can we prove that? I'm skeptical.
Yes.
Sort of thinking.
Yeah. Okay. Well, it is a recognised tradition in philosophy, and in both Eastern and Western thought. It has a long history, and I've made some interesting discoveries on my spiritual journey and as a philosopher. When I went to India and met the Jain thinkers of Jainism, which go back to 500 or so BC, because they in effect invented skepticism, I discovered. It wasn't a Western thing.
Oddly enough, I was also looking at that.
You're looking at the Jains as well. Okay. Well, there we are. I've got a double one here because the Jain thinkers, Mahavira, who was the Tirthankara of the era, meaning the Ford crosser, he realised that if we go on arguing about things none of us can prove, we're just going to go round in circles and get very upset and argue and never prove anything. So basically he said we should suspend judgment, which is a technical term in skeptical philosophical schools, and concentrate on what we do know, which is that violence is not good for us. Too much argumentation about imponderables is not good for us. So let's focus on the core common values that we can construct in common. And he coined this approach to life, which later was called by a famous Jain philosopher who came along a bit later, Anikant-Vada. And Anikant-Vada is a technical term in Jain philosophy, meaning the relativity of all views. So if I say, I believe the universe is infinite and eternal, I can't prove it, but I could hold that fiercely. Somebody else could say, no, it's not, it's finite, it was created. Look, it says in the Bible and the holy books, it's finite, and you're a heretic to say it's infinite and eternal. You must be an Aristotelian. And this battle has raged in intellectual history for millennia. And wars have been fought over even just that one point, right? Well, the Jains said both views are relative. They require each other. The idea of infinity and the idea of finitude, are interdependent. They're locked, like wrestlers locked in an eternal battle. To reach enlightenment, we have to rise above that plane of discourse. The only way we can do that is to suspend judgment on things we can't know and go to a place of quietude and peace, epoche. Anyway, this idea was they'd been practicing this, and a chap called Pyrrho of Elis, who was a philosopher from Greece, went with Alexander the Great. We know that he met gymnosophists, which was Jains, naked philosophers, and they taught him this idea, which kind of like light went off in his head, because the Greeks were all arguing about philosophy, different schools of thought, and he brought this idea of skepticism back to the West. He founded the skeptical school, which brought this concept of epoche, suspension of judgment, at its core. And he thought that by doing that, we could calm down and no longer have great battles and fights. And there was a school of skeptical philosophers ever since. Some famous names like Sextus Empiricus. Cicero was influenced by it, the Roman philosopher. Carneades, a great Greek academic. They realised there's some truth in all this. And if you think about it right now, if the UN rang me up and said, Thomas, we're failing to address the philosophical and religious aspects of conflict, can you give us some advice, please? If I've got the Secretary General of the UN, I'd say yes, start teaching philosophy, get the table in all the schools, and let's be a little more, let's teach skepticism in Israel, in Palestine, in Iran, in America. So the American right-wing nationalist Christians are totally convinced Christ is their Messiah, and the Muslims are going to hell because they follow a false prophet. You know, what they need is a strong dose of skepticism, I would say. And the same with extremist Muslims who say the Christian's going to hell because, you know, Jesus is outproved by Muhammad, and Muhammad's the last prophet, and Jesus wasn't the Son of God, and it says so in the Quran. And then the Jews come along and say, no, you're both wrong. Moses was the best prophet. You're all going to the dogs. You're all heretics. And only we, the chosen people, are the chosen people. Those battles will never finish unless we introduce a healthy dose of skepticism to them, which is suspension of judgment, and then look at the evidence, look at the facts. And that's why I'm doing my commentaries on all their holy books, because I'm trying to say, well, you know, yes, maybe. And that Syadvada is another technical term in Jainism, meaning maybe. The best we can say is maybe about the nature of ultimate things. Yes?
To illustrate, could you take the example, for example, Israeli people or Palestinian people saying, that place is my land? Or would you... Or would you treat that?
Absolutely, we could run a beautiful philosophy club in Jerusalem on this and invite them to come, the settlers, Palestinians, whatever. What we would say is, what's your evidence that this is your land? Show us the facts.
Yes.
Show us the empirical evidence that you own this land. Right?
Both have good evidence.
Both could yes, and then we would ask, well, okay, but where did your great-grandfather get it from? Because some Palestinians have Ottoman deeds going back to the 1890s showing that their olive farm, belongs to them. Okay, but where did that come from? Where did that come from? And if you go further and further back, and of course then the Jews say, no, well, it was in the Bible. This land was all given to us by, by God. But then you ask, well, who wrote the Bible? Where did the Bible come from? Oh, well, and this is where the Christian nationalist fundamentalists say, well, it's all the revealed word of God. We don't have to know where it came from, we just accept it. Well, no, the skeptic says, let's look at the first texts. Where did the text we have come from? When was it first written down? How do we know that God had the authority? I mean, which God? had the authority. Well, what about all the other gods? Were they consulted? Didn't they have a say? What about the Aramaic gods of Geshur? What about Hadad, the storm god? Was he asked? So we can then get people to begin to question their own certitudes. And then I think where I'd go with that conversation, it would be a 5-day workshop, is, okay, so we don't really know, actually. We can't absolutely prove that this is our land. Ultimately, we have a bigger army than you. But that's not a moral proof. That's not a valid proof.
Amoral proof.
It's an amoral proof, yeah. Because, then, Russia can appear with nuclear missiles and say, well, actually, I think we're going to reclaim this land because we've got bigger weapons than you, or Britain could do the same. So I think we end up in a place of doubt. And now enter Descartes, the French philosopher, who was a skeptic, and he said, doubt is the beginning of philosophy. Because only when we have the courage to doubt what we thought we were certain about can we begin to do philosophy. So skepticism and that was Socrates' point. Why Socrates questioned and introduced dialectic into Athens was because he wanted to lead people away from their certitudes to a place of doubt. I don't know how many gods there are. I don't know if the gods demand this or that. So I think that's how it would work.
Thank you.
And from that suspension of judgment and that doubt, we can get to a place of peace, because we can back off our certitude. I'm so certain I'm right, I'm going to kill you. That's a horrendous statement to make. I might be wrong, actually.
I'm skeptical to that.
And therefore I won't kill you. I'll embrace you as my brother in doubt, effectively. And that became the academic method, which Plato and Socrates, developed, and it was boosted by the skeptical schools. And we could also add to the list of skeptics Montaigne in France here, as well as Descartes, who introduced these ideas in the Renaissance. Pierre Bayle, who was the coiner of the phrase "the Republic of Letters," which is what nation do you belong to? They said, I'm a citizen of the Republic of Letters, which I agree with. And Voltaire, who was from that same cycle of Enlightenment thinkers, he said, no, let's not be so fanatical in our opinions. Because he was most distressed. The French Catholic Imperium of Louis XIV had gone around Europe terrorising Protestants. And in France, in the Cevennes, there were massacres of Protestants in the name of the French state, just as there had been in the Pyrenees earlier in the medieval times against the Cathars. And Voltaire said, no, this is ridiculous. None of us should claim to have that degree of certainty. And Hume in Britain echoed this, a Scots philosopher. He said scepticism is the first mark of philosophy. And Husserl, who took these ideas further, he said, well then let's do phenomenology. Let's look at the phenomena of life, examine them and suspend judgment. Let's practice epoche. So, it's a living tradition. And if anyone's interested, a man called Popkin wrote a whole history of skepticism and the history of thought, which goes into all this. He lived in the 20th century. And I think we should also, just a final caution, I think we should be sceptical of science, because in a sense science came forward and said, well then we should all be scientists. Give us all the money, shut down all the theology schools and the philosophy departments, they're useless. But no, because science has become a dogmatism in its own name. I think this is the danger. So we need to be sceptical even of science now, and ask deep questions of it. Anyway, they're both very exciting, these choices. Any comments, feedback? Does that clarify it a bit?
Yeah, Actually, that we always have thoughts and comments, but right now it's. I think it's.
Ça suffit pour maintenant. Okay. And then in Norway and Scandinavia, there's, there are skeptical philosophers in that lineage, but they've also ended up, like Arne Næss, saying that some things we can affirm, like the importance of nature, the importance of man's ecological relationships to nature. Sometimes one has to suspend judgment on skepticism even, and affirm things,
Yeah.
So that's a added twist at the end. Okay, let's go to our 99 names of peace. Give me a number between 1 and 50.
23.
Oh, we had that. You've already chosen that one.
Did I?
Sure. Yeah, you always do 23. We've said that before.
Why?
Yeah. Okay, you have a number.
Number 2.
Oh, okay. That's right. Ha! Well, this is very appropriate then. It's the Multi-Faith and Multicultural Mediation and Arbitration Service, number 2. And the language is Spanish, which is one of the great languages of the world. Millions of people speak it. I'm sad to say I don't, but I love, Spanish literature and language and poetry especially. So the Multi-Faith, Multicultural Mediation Service is something, it came to me as an idea for a project in 1996. In 1994 I went to the Vatican to the 6th World Conference on Religion and Peace, which took place in the Vatican, when Pope John Paul II was there, and there were about 800 religious leaders from every faith on the planet had been invited. Many famous names that were cardinals and bishops and senior Buddhists and Muslims and rabbis, Jewish and pagans. There were shamans from different pagan traditions from all over the world, and it was just a very inspiring meeting. And then we went, for the business part of the thing, we went up to Riva del Garda, and we all stayed there, up in the north, near Lake Garda. And I was asked to chair one of the working groups, which was on the role of religion in conflict resolution. I was doing my PhD, I was teaching at the University of London, and there was a room full of really amazing people. I was only in my late 20s kind of thing. I felt like a kid who walked into a sweet shop. And there was an old Jewish lady who said that she and her group had lobbied Roosevelt to make sure the UN started with the phrase "we the peoples" instead of "we the governments," because she and her group wanted to make sure that we the peoples have the ultimate power in the UN, not the governments. They ought to reread the constitution of the UN, in my opinion. So she was there, and leading Buddhists and all kinds of others. There was a wonderful Christian from Ethiopia. They were all professors and learned people and like equivalents of bishops in their own faiths. And it was a time when the Balkan Wars were kicking off, and Serbs and Croats were fighting each other, and Srebrenica had gone up, and people were massacring each other in the name of religion, right? And of course, the Middle East was having another round of its normal Palestinian-Israeli wars that were going on. Northern Ireland, they were still bombing each other for Catholic and Protestant. Well, they're just coming to the end of that, thank God. Anyway, I was sitting there, and I trained as a mediator. In California, I trained as a mediator in schools and in communities, right, dealing with disputes. And so, sitting there thinking about it and talking to the group, I had this sudden brainwave. Why don't we have a mediation service comprising trained religious elders, experts in their faith communities, be it Muslim, Jewish, Christian, Buddhist, or whatever, who would be available like a fire brigade when conflicts break out anywhere in the world that involve those faiths. So, if the Middle East is an obvious example, if Jewish settlers are slaughtering Christians, because they say Christ was the Antichrist or whatever they say, he wasn't the real Messiah, and they start torching homes, and then the Christians fight back. Well, then our team could go in and try and mediate and work with the leaders of the different communities and say, look, hang on, in authentic Judaism, it never said, slaughter the other. For 1,000 years, Christians and Jews and Muslims have lived in peace. And these authorities and those authorities could be quoted, and these passages in the Talmud and so on, the Torah, in the prophets, peace is preferable to war. So anyway, that was the idea. I came back to Oxford. I was teaching at the University of Oxford, and we had a training for it, and I got a group of about 30 people together, and then set it up. So the Multi-Faith, Multicultural Mediation Service was pioneered in the 90s. It's still going. It's the only one of its kind, which is ironic. Like, you'd have thought the UN or someone would have done this. Why is it down to me? There is a group in New York State that there's a great black theologian who's got a similar thing going, but they're not an actual mediation service. They just deal with trying to solve religious conflicts and stuff. And America is a teeming mass of all different ethnicities and religions, so it's a good place for it. And since then I've dealt with particular conflicts, the mediation service has. But to be honest, we're sort of swamped. There's too much to do. So I've tried to get Ukraine and Russia. Before the invasion, I was writing letters to Putin through his ambassador in France, trying to mediate. The same with Gaza and Palestine. So, and I'll continue, but I mean, there's not enough hours in the day to do all the work that's needed. I could have a team of 3 secretaries just working full-time on that one project. And we are trying to upscale it. So with Inga Meta from Norway, we're trying to raise funding to actually have staff that can do it. Because it shouldn't be down to me alone and just a few, volunteers. We need, professional attention onto this.
We need professional help.
Yeah, that's a good way of putting it, absolutely. Yeah. And yet, obviously it was done as volunteers. I mean, I've given my time for free to this project, and the mediators did as well. But also, if we're going to do it professionally, I think it's fair that our expenses are covered, and that the basic, mediators have practical issues. Like if we're going to do a mediation in Paris, then we all, we need the costs covered at the very least.
Can't go there for free.
Well, that would be more difficult. So anyway, that's the project. Okay. And if anyone wants more details, and that's what inspired me to write the 99 Names of Peace, is to look at the language, because part of that project all along was I've come to the view that most of these conflicts are linguistic puzzles. The fighting between religion X or religion Y is often a linguistic puzzle. What do you really mean by the Son of God, as Christians claim Jesus was? If you actually go into it in depth, as I've done, and then explain that to a Muslim, they can say, I see, it's a metaphor. It's an elevated position, that it means you really love Christ. It's a statement of your feelings towards Christ. I get it. And the phrase Son of God was in Greek, used of Alexander the Great, Hercules, and so on, heroes. The same in the Druid community.